Hi guys, welcome to this last workshop in the Matter Matters series. So this workshop, a little bit more like last workshop, is going to be much more sculpture focused. It's 3D outcomes only in this workshop, so we're not going to be doing any sketching, albeit you might describe what we're doing as sketching, just not with a pen and pencil. I'd like us to think a little bit about, working with sculptural materials, something which is also not necessarily a precious finished thing all the time. It's something that we're playing with and developing. So for this workshop, you're going to need, probably in a smaller quantity, modelling wax. This might be a material that you haven't really used before. Obviously when we come to use it, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but this plus your modelling tools, really useful. The other thing that you're going to need is some organic objects or some sort of alternate objects that you're sort of happy to work into your sculpture later on. It would be good if you thought about this a little bit and there might be some sort of additional meaning behind why you're using the natural form that you choose to incorporate into your sculpture, but this is something that you'll need later on. We're also going to need a mirror, some way of seeing yourself, or if you're choosing to work with somebody else's image or somebody else's portrait, you're going to need obviously photographs of that individual to work with as well. And if you are working with images of somebody else, probably a couple of different shots or even photographs of yourself from different angles, because obviously we are working three-dimensionally today. I'm going to talk really briefly about our influence or reference for today's session, who is the artist Henry Moore. So Henry Moore is probably one of the most famous sculptors that the UK has ever produced. Obviously he's working in a period that we normally refer to as the modern era or modernism. Henry Moore's work actually had a massive influence on foundries in the UK. So up until then, many artists were actually travelling over to Italy to get their pieces cast in the Italian or lost wax casting process, which is the process that I use. And the UK was more or less an industrial sand casting sort of nation. But Henry Moore worked with Italian families that actually came over to the UK, families like the Fiorini brothers, who have gone on to set up foundries that are still operating today. So the production of his work had a massive impact on the industry as well as on cultural production in the UK. So the influence that we're bringing into today's workshop via Henry Moore is sort of incorporating other materials into your sculpture. I kind of struck upon this by going to an exhibition at the Hepworth Wakefield Museum, which is a gallery museum in Yorkshire, and they had an exhibition on Henry Moore and Bill Brunt, who's actually, Bill Brunt is a photographer and was a good friend of Henry Moore's as well as working at the same time. And his photographs share a lot of the same subjects as Henry Moore's work. So they both investigated the Blitz, they took a lot of shared subjects from the shelters there and mining families as well. Both of them worked on those as subjects for their artwork. But Bill Brunt's photography also actually documents a lot of Henry Moore's processes. And he documented sculptures, maquettes, which is sort of the earlier stages of a sculpture's development. He photographed a lot of these for Henry Moore. And from these photographs we can see sort of how Henry Moore started to sort of develop his style, how he used other materials completely separate to the normal sculptural process of working in clay or wax or stone even, and started to sort of manipulate these and literally build them into his designs. So I think it's kind of obvious when you start to look at Moore's work that these are an influence, but he used to work a lot with skulls, bones, flagstones and flints. And these are natural materials which actually have kind of quite strong abstracted forms in their own right. So I think when you look at these, you can sort of start to imagine that they could be something else anyway. A little bit like if you've ever looked at clouds and started to sort of interpret shapes from those that are almost there but not quite. And Moore played on this with these materials. So he started to actually take flints, flagstones, bones as the basis of his maquettes and built them out. So he added wax or clay to those objects and actually started to direct them into new forms and new shapes. Looking at these forms, so having them in the back of his mind, started to change the way that he was playing with abstraction, how he started to sort of represent the figure in his drawings, and developed works which were later on completely unconnected to these objects, but the sort of original formal properties of these organic shapes really influenced the way that he abstracted and developed the figure in his work as a sculptor. So we're going to begin with our first sculptural project. Working with the modelling wax, we're going to develop basically a portrait, as I say, self-portrait or one built from images of another person if you prefer to work that way. Now, modelling wax, to talk a little bit about this material before we get started, is different to clay. You'll find that when you touch it to start with, it's very hard, and basically the more you work this wax in your hands, the more it warms up, the easier it's going to be to work with. It's kind of the opposite to clay, which tends to dry out the more that you touch it. What's quite useful about this material also is that if things really aren't going well, you can leave it and come back to it, and it's actually something which you can work with over several days if you want to. It doesn't dry up like clay does. As I say, you don't have to keep sort of wetting it or keeping it wrapped up in a plastic bag to contain the moisture. It's a really useful material for sort of working with an idea over a long period of time, because you can model something, as I say, leave it, start totally from scratch, and the material doesn't lose its ability to be modelled or manipulated the way that clay sometimes does if you leave it out too long. Now, when I work with wax, I find it's quite useful to actually work with smaller pieces and build up. So I know in clay we tend to just roll like a big thick ball, and then we sort of, start to sort of squeeze that out or extend from sort of one main shape. Wax actually, just because of the way that it becomes more usable, the warmer it is much easier to work with if you're building up little pieces. When I'm working, I tend to try and have like a couple of pieces in the palm of my hand whilst I'm working with something else. It just ensures that I've got a constant flow of usable wax. Obviously, if you get really frustrated or your hands happen to be very cold, you can use a hairdryer or some other heat source to kind of speed up the process. You might want to maybe put some wax on some foil and sit it on the radiator for a couple of minutes just to get it started, if you're really finding that you cannot get the wax to move the way that you'd like it to. Remember also that you should have your modelling tools from last time, and you can still mark make in this and use those to build texture into your wax as you're working as well. Wax is also something which can get sort of into fabric fibres quite easily, so I really recommend making sure that you don't drop any little bits into the carpet if you're in a household where people are going to be worried about that. If you're working, I would try to keep it on a table or on a board, or just something that's going to kind of stop it from sticking to everything, because obviously the warmer it gets, it will reharden, but only to sort of a certain degree. If it's stuck into a carpet, it's going to be a bit like chewing gum, quite hard to get that out of, as I say, of a fabric. Okay guys, so I'm going to start a timer now for 20 minutes, and this is going to be your opportunity just to model a portrait. So there's no need to abstract this portrait. You can actually on this occasion really work with what you can see. So starting 20 minutes now. Okay guys, that's it. Hopefully you're pleased with what you've produced, but as ever, don't worry too much if it's not something you're 100% happy with. We're always developing and changing our ideas in these workshops. So in this next part, we're going to be taking another 20 minutes to basically either start a new portrait, or if you'd like to, depending on how you feel about your first portrait, incorporate this organic material into it. So coming back to the Henry Moore maquettes that I showed you at the start of this workshop, there's two things you can do with incorporating this material. So you can either use it to start to sort of abstract and change the forms that you're working with within this sculpture, so maybe simplifying it in the way that we find a lot of modern sculptures used to do, working with imitating some of those organic forms in our sculpture. Or if you want to, you could look at this as a material that's bringing an additional level of meaning to your sculpture. So when I mentioned earlier about potentially picking something which has a sort of additional meaning to it. I guess what I'm asking you to think about is, what impact is this combination of materials going to have on the overall sort of feeling or idea that your piece of work is communicating? Some objects obviously have more meaning than others. I mean, if you're building a piece of bone into your sculpture, there's going to be connotations of sort of death and decay that you might want to sort of emphasize in the way that you use it. Alternatively, maybe you picked something from the beach because the person that you're modeling loves the coast, or maybe you love the coast, so you're using a rock in that way. Or maybe you've just picked something which you really enjoy the texture of, and as I say, just the formal properties of it. Maybe it's an object that you just find really interesting to look at, and you can sort of see how you might build this into something which is a bit more sculptural, which maybe can be used as an exaggeration in your portrait. So like, what part of the face are you going to use it? You might be thinking a little bit about, very, very early incorporations of like coins as eyes when people used to pass away. In the past, old rituals used to include laying sort of pennies over people's eyes so they could pay the ferrymen at the river Styx. Again, you might not immediately think, if you decided to use pennies over your eyes, that's what you're sort of alluding to, but somebody else might see that and suddenly see the portrait that you've produced as being a bit more of a death mask. So these materials all bring like an added element to the work. They're communicating another idea, and I want you to keep that in mind when you're working. How are you going to use the changing shape of the object? If you've got something which is very flat like this, are you actually going to use it as a kind of relief, as a base for building pattern and texture onto? Or if you've got something which is more of an object in its own right, how is that going to become a body? Will it form the whole of the body and you just build off it? Or will it just be one element of the body? Are there forms in it that you can already see will contribute to your portrait or would be useful as part of your portrait? Try to think about how the object in its own right will impact your design. It may be that you actually use this object in a slightly different way. Perhaps you're going to press it into the surface of the wax and try to recreate some of that texture. Building it into the sculpture, you might first use it on some separate pieces to sort of transfer, as I say, the texture of the object, which you could then use on other parts of the sculpture. So I'm going to start this timer now for 20 minutes, and this is going to be your opportunity to, as I say, either start a brand new portrait, or if you want to sort of build this piece into what you've already started. Now, obviously, wax is a material that we normally associate with an ongoing process. So this piece, again, is something that I want you to feel quite relaxed about. It doesn't have to be a finished, perfect sculpture that's going to sit on a plinth for everyone to look at. We're really trying to use this material as something which is basically akin to you sketching in a sketchbook and working something out. It's just another way of exploring an idea. So I'm going to start the timer now for 20 minutes. So like our other workshops, we're going to take 5 minutes now just to have a little bit of a think, a little bit of a reflection on the process and the materials that we've worked with today. So I want you to think a little bit about why you chose the object that you did to incorporate into your sculpture. Did you feel that incorporating this actually changed the meaning of your work? How did it do this? Did the object that you chose to incorporate have anything to do with the subject, as in yourself or the person that you were modelling? I also want you to think a little bit about working with wax opposed to working to clay. Maybe sort of compare those. Which one do you prefer? Do you like the fact you could come back to using the wax, or did you just find it a really frustrating material that you didn't really like touching very much? So I hope that you've enjoyed working with the wax, and also that you're pleased with the effect that you've achieved by incorporating this additional material element into your work.